Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And we're going to start pretty much on time. I know we'll have a good number of questions. A particular welcome to those of you here in person, and a welcome to those of you who are joining us by webcast. It's another important moment in the PR19 journey and the ongoing reform of the water sector. Before I get going on the price review, I think I just want to pause and say how proud I am, as chairman of Ofwat, of the whole Ofwat team. They've worked tirelessly to get us here. It's hard to put into words the dedication, the determination, and the long hours, particularly in this stage of the process where we've been dealing with slow-tracked and significant scrutiny categories. But we have reached this point with what I call really calm competence in the Ofwat team, particularly under David's leadership of the PR19 team. There is, of course, still more work ahead of us. Now, today, as usual, we'll go into a bit more depth and detail for you, and you're, as the investment community, a really important constituent in this discussion. To reflect that, you've got three of us as board members of Ofwat here. If you don't know me, I'm Johnson Cox. Importantly, we have Rachel Fletcher, our CEO, with us, David Black, who is the Senior Director responsible for leading PR19. And many of you will know Jamie, who's your point and day-to-day contact with the investment community. There are other Ofwat colleagues in the audience. Now, a few observations from me, just to get us going, about what the future might hold and how, as a sector, we might respond. You don't need me to identify this, but in the context of where the sector is, the challenges faced represent, in my mind, the biggest since the early days post-privatisation. This is because it's so multifaceted: operational, climatic, societal, and political. Challenges come from all sides, and each dimension is fundamental. What is this sector's place in society? Who should own it? How should it be run? In whose interests? Does the sector understand the change in expectations on the horizon? What's the plan to respond and make the most of opportunities and delivering expectations? And above all, how does the sector secure its legitimacy? Over the last few weeks, we've had yet more reminders of the scale of some of the issues: record enforcement action, the Environment Agency's damning assessment of the sector's environmental performance, the Secretary of State's intervention yesterday. Customer representatives and interests have repeated their call for price cuts last week. Now, of anyone, I can rehearse all the great successes of this sector, and I know that it can rise to the challenges that we're putting forward today. But we're not in the place as a sector where we need to be. I do repeatedly hear the argument that as the regulator, we're compounding the misery for the sector when we take regulatory action. And some look to us, vocally, to defend the sector. We do care really deeply about the water industry, but it's fundamentally to misunderstand and to misdiagnose the situation. It would not serve the interests of the sector if the independent regulator took on the role of being its cheerleader. Parliament has given us a role, and that's to hold the sector to account on behalf of customers and all stakeholders and help drive up performance. By responding effectively, including to yesterday's draft determinations, companies can secure trust and move reputation forward. I want to just talk about 5 dimensions that I think are important in the change we're driving through PR19. Fast-track companies made those commitments right off the bat. Others face them as a result of draft determinations, and I know they can rise to it. First is about driving a meaningful shift on operational performance and customer service. In this review, companies have done the best ever job of engagement with their customers. But customers do still rely on a regulator to determine difficult questions, such as, for instance, what's the achievable level of efficiency? We've shifted, and we've been on this mission, we've been shifting focus back to running the business really well. Mechanisms like performance commitments and ODIs. We're using comparative benchmarking to set a forward-looking upper quartile, in statistical jargon, challenge on common performance commitments. Companies that fail to meet that challenge could see up to half their profitability eroded, but it's matched by an ability to significantly outperform on the return on equity, as indeed Severn Trent has shown in this period. The second is our use of upper quartile efficiency, stretching but achievable improvements to drive efficiency and promote productivity, which has been poor in this sector. Now, I've just been taking a part out in the coffee here about the level of our challenge to base costs. But I'd encourage you to look all the way around these issues. So I was challenged about a company where I think the cost gap between what they want and what we've allowed is 16%. And how on earth should a company deliver that? Look at the flip side on that particular one. We're allowing 15% more from April next year compared to current spend levels. So do just walk all the way around these issues. The third one of my dimensions is improving environmental performance and resilience of the sector. Over and above 37 billion of expenditure to run and maintain existing assets and service, we're allowing 12 billion of investment in environment and resilience programs. That's about a quarter up on what we allowed at the last period. The fourth dimension for me is reflecting the movement in capital markets. Rates continue to come down. The risk-free rate that underpins our whole calculation has reduced. There is still a wall of money that wants to invest in infrastructure. One bank told me of a number of 180 billion a few weeks ago, chasing quality assets, and water companies are certainly quality assets. The WACC may have come down, but it's in line with current rates. Indeed, they've moved further since we made our decision a few months ago. The last point that I want to make, which underpins the whole determination, is our back in balance agenda. This puts investor, customer and public interest in alignment. It should create confidence that while remaining an incentive regime, and I underline that, we believe strongly in incentives, and rewarding investors appropriately, that companies don't disrupt their financial stability. Rewards are given in return for delivering for people and the environment. Some companies have done a good job in this review on transparent dividend and remuneration policies that reflect performance for all stakeholders. A good number still have a way to go on this to accord with our new policies. There is some deleveraging. The range of that's quite wide, and again, some have a way to go. And on how this review sits in our overall framework, Rachel's been leading work with the sector to explore and agree a future vision, and I'll turn to her shortly to highlight that work. But just before I do so, again, I've been challenged this morning about demanding challenges for the sector. But you know, this isn't unique to the water sector. That's common across business. And I'd like to leave you with a thought that amongst all these challenges and the complexity of all the day-to-day interactions and the latest events unfolding around us, please don't miss the wood for the trees. Let's just revisit the investor proposition in this sector. A guaranteed customer base, guaranteed product demand, guaranteed revenues, index linking of both asset base and revenues. For those with the slower growing RCV asset base, a strong cash yield for dividend. For those with a faster growing RCV, and there's some really quite remarkably fast growing RCV numbers in this review, good cash generation to support reinvestment. There are material performance incentives that can materially improve equity returns. And there's a chance for what this review is, which is a reset every 5 years on behalf of all parties. I believe that remains an attractive proposition, even in this world of lower returns. We seek to create public service utilities where investors, customers and the public interest, are on a constitutionally equal and fair level. I believe that's in the interest of all parties, including investors. And I just say to you as the investment community, please join us in being a positive force for shaping that agenda of renewal and the creation of legitimacy in this sector. I'm going to move on because we're here to discuss PR19. Companies have had extensive opportunities to comment, convince and evidence their case. We expect them to respond to our draft decisions to reflect how they can improve their business plan and any final representations of matters we've missed. And then final determinations will be back here in December. Now on that, let me pause and ask Rachel to take us through how this price review process sits in the overall strategy looking forward of Ofwat. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. I know that you've all come here to drill into the fine detail of the PR19 draft determinations. But if Johnson's message is to look at PR19 against the wider backdrop he's just painted, mine is to see PR19 not as an end in itself, but as the first step towards the future that we're setting out in the joint vision for the sector. So before you hear from David, let me say a few things about that vision and sketch out a few highlights from the draft Ofwat strategy for 2020 and beyond. Many of you will already know that we've spoken to stakeholders and customers around the country to forge a draft joint vision for the sector. And the idea is to give us a common ambition that we can jointly own and play a role in delivering. And when I say we, I mean regulators and policymakers, as well as companies and their owners. 3 themes have emerged from this work, and across the sector we're seeing a huge amount of support for these 3 themes, and you can see them on the slide there. I'm going to start with everyday excellence. This theme alludes to the fact that we all rely on water and waste services every day. And it also recognises that excellence isn't static, that frontiers are changing, that what might have looked like excellent service 5 or 10 years ago might today look substandard or disappointing. And we only need to think about how Amazon has changed our expectations on delivery times as an example. Here you can see the continuum from PR19. This price review is all about setting more ambitious performance targets with corresponding penalties and rewards. And with the introduction of CMEX, the start of a journey to set customer service standards with reference to that achieved in other industries. We know that population growth and climate change, as well as constantly changing customer expectations, makes the aspiration of excellence challenging for the sector. But we also know that new technology, big data, new ways of working have the potential to allow the water sector, like every other sector in the economy, to continually improve and get ahead of these challenges. So as part of our strategy, we've thought long and hard about whether we are doing enough to bring forward the kind of innovation that I've just been talking about. And particularly, we've thought about the barriers to innovation, especially where innovation is bringing risks or requires a longer-term payoff than a 5-year period would allow. And that's why last week we consulted on introducing a £200 million innovation fund that companies might compete to use. And I'd encourage you to take a look at this and respond to our consultation if you've got ideas on how Ofwat can play a constructive role in driving further innovation in the sector. The second theme is stewardship for the future. I don't need to tell you that the water sector is all about the long term. Long-lived assets, the protection of precious natural resources, stewardship of relationships and reputation, and returns over the long term for investors. And here again, you can see this theme of stewardship picked up in PR19. Resilience is a massive theme. As Johnson's already said, we're expecting £12 billion of investment over the next 5 years to meet the needs of future customers and to provide a healthier environment. And there are also stretching environmental targets on pollution, river cleanup, leakage and per capita consumption. One shift we are signalling in our draft strategy for 2020 and beyond is the need for Ofwat to focus more on the long term. And in particular, we are looking to introduce some long-term targets for the sector, well beyond the 5-year horizon that we're talking about today. We're already working with the Environment Agency, the Drinking Water Inspectorate, and governments in England and Wales on these targets. We expect these to be high-level, strategic targets that provide further clarity to the sector on where we should be aiming for in 15 to 20 years' time, without prescribing exactly how we get there. I'd expect these targets to complement, not replace, the 2030 commitments the sector has already made, for example, on zero net carbon and on single-use plastics. And this suite of longer-term commitments should mean that really well-performing companies should be aspiring not just to hit the PR19 targets, but to get themselves well on track to meeting where the sector needs to be by 2030. And of course, these targets will provide additional certainty for investors. The final theme is value for customers and society. And this final aspiration in the joint draft vision is perhaps the most distinctive. Everyone is used to value for money and value for money for customers being a big focus for the sector. And in the PR19 draft determinations, we're certainly challenging companies to improve efficiency and bring down bills by £50 on average in real terms over the next 5 years. And for your part, you'll be concerned to get a fair return for investment, and that is something that Johnson has already touched on. But what is new in this part of the joint vision statement is the recognition that water companies can deliver significant social and environmental value as they go about their core role of providing water and waste services to customers. For example, the opportunity to help deprived communities and build human capital through the choices companies make on apprenticeships, training and employment. Or the opportunity to clean up rivers and create environmental value through using catchment management solutions in water and waste treatment. Many of the things that we have in mind here can be delivered with no extra cost to customers, and sometimes bring cost savings or attract new funding sources from partnerships. Now, we are seeing signs of this. It's great to see more catchment management projects in the PR19 business plans, for example. Many of these projects are being done in partnership, and some have attracted significant funding from corporates like Nestle or large charities like the National Trust. But consideration of the public value that can be created is still an afterthought in all companies, rather than something that runs through the lifeblood of the business. And while it would take a radical turnaround in the industry's mindset, the water companies have an opportunity, I think, to be the poster child of ethical business, with their strong roots in communities and their environmental footprint. They have an opportunity to play an extensive role, for example, in meeting the country's 25-year environment plan ambition to leave the environment in a better condition than we found it. You've probably twigged that this part of the vision forms a natural extension from the new board leadership objectives we've recently put in the licence, and particularly the requirement for company boards to have a clear purpose reflecting the needs of all stakeholders. I'm pleased to see the industry grapple with this part of the vision. It's what sits behind the Water UK public interest commitment, which, along with ambitious targets on carbon, plastics, leakage, poverty and social inclusion, includes the agreement that all companies will consider by April next year how they can enshrine their public interest commitment into their business. And you may know that Anglian Water has already changed its articles of association in response, and some have requested licence changes. This is a good step forward, and one we stand ready to support where we can. But what I would say at this juncture is that while the industry is embracing its public purpose, this could help it build legitimacy and tap into the significant pot of ESG finance which is available worldwide. I think it will only be successful in increasing the legitimacy of the sector if on top of this, the sector delivers its core services excellently, it is accompanied by responsible corporate decisions and behaviours on tax, financing structures, executive performance pay and dividends. And finally, if there's also robust and transparent evidence of delivery against these ambitions. In Ofwat, we are also considering what this focus on a wider value might mean for how we regulate. We should be joining with other regulators and policymakers to make sure that there is a framework that allows the sector to strike an appropriate balance between the value created for bill payers, for society, for future generations, for the environment and for investors. And we're already considering how the PR24 process might apply different treatment to companies depending on their success in delivering wider value for society. But now I'm talking about PR24, I'm definitely getting ahead of myself. But I hope this has whet your appetite and encourages you to engage with us on the vision for the sector and the strategy for Ofwat. I hope it shows you that our ambition for the industry goes way beyond the stretching targets in PR19, and that companies embarking on the next AMP should have their sights set on the future too. And with that, I'll hand over to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Johnson. So we started on our journey to the 2019 price review with engagement on the challenges facing the sector, and we identified 4 key themes with companies and other stakeholders that we considered vital to address in the 2019 price review. These were great customer service, resilience in the round, affordability, and innovation. Our focus is on innovation is particularly relevant to boosting productivity in the sector, point touched on by Johnson earlier. As shown in the graph, the sector's track record on productivity was very strong in the period between 1990 and 2010. And these are in this sector's own view of the numbers, but very disappointing since then, even taking account of quality improvements. In order to face the challenges, or in order to address the challenges facing the sector and to maintain affordability, the sector really must improve its productivity. In January, we announced our initial assessment of plans, fast-tracking 3 companies, Severn Trent Water, South West Water and United Utilities, whose plans had already reached our high bar, and we published their draft determinations 3 months ago. The remaining companies, categorised as slow track and significant scrutiny, had further work to do on their plans. We have now set out our draft determinations and our view of their price and service and incentive packages that they will deliver for their customers between 2020 and 2025. These packages incentivise companies to make a step change in their performance for customers and the environment, and it secures the investment needed to provide resilient and sustainable services now and into the future. And at the same time, it delivers real price reductions for all customers. Underpinning all of this is both the enablers and expectations of improved productivity. I'll now talk through some of the particular elements of the package. Firstly, on the outcomes framework. So our outcomes framework focuses companies on delivering the high-level objectives that matter to today's customers and future customers and the environment. We expected companies to propose stretching performance commitments to benefit customers and to back these up with financial and reputational incentives. The outcomes framework gives companies the freedom to decide how to deliver for their customers, enabling companies to innovate and find new ways of delivering services. Early evidence in the water sector during this period and from the energy sector suggests that an outcomes approach, along with a total expenditure approach, facilitates efficiency improvements and service improvements. In regard to performance commitments, many companies responded to the challenges set out in our initial assessment of their plans and accepted the performance commitments based on forward-looking upper quartile performance. And of course, all companies have accepted our challenge to reduce leakage by at least 15%. Our interventions at draft determination have been generally to increase performance levels for some companies and to push laggards further to close the gap between them and the rest of the sector. In a few cases, though, we have also intervened to reduce the performance levels that are consistent with that funded by base service costs. For the 3 upper quartile performance commitments for water supply interruptions, internal sewer flooding and pollution incidents, we also considered the challenge in the round, taking account of historical improvements in previous periods and the overnight adjustment required in 2020. And on this basis, we decided a glide path was required in regard to water supply interruptions to smooth the overnight adjustment required at 2020, but we retain the same end goal of forward-looking upper quartile by the end of the period. We consider that the performance commitments in our draft determinations are stretching, but achievable at a sector level and across the whole period. Outcome delivery incentives. These are the underperformance payments and the outperformance payments that back the performance commitments. They help align management and shareholders' interests to those of customers, increasing the focus on improving service that customers care about. In PR19, we've been very clear that we expect a greater proportion of revenue to be linked to service performance. It's also important to note that performance commitments are set on an absolute basis, so it's possible, if very unlikely, that all companies could outperform their performance commitments and earn net ODI outperformance payments in the next price control period. When we considered company plans in the initial assessment of plans, we found a wide variation in the level of ODI rates across companies for the same increments of performance, and that these variations could not be explained by differences across operating areas and factors such as comparative and current performance, water stress, metering penetration, and household income. We therefore required companies to explain the outcome delivery incentive levels in relation to a reasonable range based on a half standard deviation around the average for the sector. In response, in their revised business plans, companies have narrowed the gap substantially, but there is still significant variation between companies on some measures. And so we have intervened to improve the consistency of ODI rates across the sector. Now, we're not aiming to make ODI rates the same across all companies, and we accept there are reasons for variation, but we are concerned that the rates are set on a robust and reasonable basis. So we've applied a series of horizontal and company-specific tests to assess company proposals to make our interventions. And as part of their draft determination representations, we expected companies to provide us with an updated view of the P10 and P90 range for their performance commitments and ODIs. As a result of our interventions in the draft determinations, we expect the outcome delivery incentive range to range from around minus 2.6% for the sector to plus 0.6%. So yes, there is a negative skew in these rates, but there was at PR14 as well, of minus 1.7 to 0.6%. And when you look at company performance during the PR14 period, they are currently performing 10 basis points above the expected level with a range of minus 0.5 to plus 1.5. So real evidence that companies are able to outperform on their performance commitments and beat expectations set in the final determinations. Cost efficiency. So firstly, in terms of, we've talked about already the increased enhancement investments. So this is investment to help reduce the pressure on scarce water resources and meet the needs for resilient systems and services. So a substantial part of this program is going on environmental enhancements, consistent with the UK government's Water Industry National Environment Programme and the Welsh Government's environmental programme in Wales. We're also allowing £450 million for collaborative work to develop and enable new strategic water resources, such as major new reservoirs and a north-south link, to help ensure we have enough water resources in the long term. And also to address our concerns that companies' approach to planning gave insufficient consideration to new supply options within and between regions. In PR19, we've also introduced direct procurement for customers, a process for water companies to competitively tender for a third party to design, build, finance, operate and maintain infrastructure. We identified a major scheme with United Utilities in their fast-track business plan, and also have identified further opportunities in Anglian and Welsh water areas at the slow-track draft determinations. Moving on to efficiency, already a topic of discussion I hear. So this slide sets out our total cost allowance for all companies at draft determination, and it compares to business plans and then with historical spending. So you can observe that there is a substantial cost challenge to the sector at draft determination, the difference between the £54.8 billion and 48.6. But you can also observe that compared to historical spending levels, the reduction is rather more modest, of around 2 to 3%. So we've been very clear throughout the price review process that we expect a genuine step up in efficiency, in which companies can make full use of the opportunities under the Water 2020 framework and unleashing the power of innovation. Companies have strong incentives to outperform on efficiency and have done so at a sector level in previous price reviews. Since 2015, companies have outperformed on average by around 60 basis points in RORE terms, with a range of minus 1.5 to plus 3.3%. Again, much better than was expected at PR14 final determination. In coming to our view of efficient costs, we consider evidence both within the sector and also comparing the sector with the wider economy. We've taken an upper quartile approach and applied an efficiency challenge along with it. So in terms of the results, you'll see on this slide range from an efficiency challenge on a TOTEX level to slightly over 20% to a rather more modest challenge at the other end of the scale. So we have identified some companies, namely Anglian Water, Thames Water, Yorkshire Water and SES Water, as continuing to put forward increases over their current base costs without sufficient justification, rather than making efficiency savings. And that's where our interventions look the most substantial. So moving on to the cost of capital. So we've updated our view of the cost of capital for draft determinations. Sorry, I'll skip that slide in the interest of time. So it's lower than what we set in our final methodology in 2017 by 21 basis points. And at an appointee level, our cost of capital in CPH terms is 3.19%, or at the wholesale level, 3.08%. So the main driver of the reduction in the cost of capital is firstly on a lower risk-free rates due to changes in market expectations about forward rates, and data on the equity beta points to a lower required return for water company equity. Our view of the cost of debt has not moved very much at all, but however we have updated our calculations to reflect the updated data and also to make greater use of wider market debt to measure the embedded cost of debt. We've also revised our split between embedded and new debt to move the level of embedded debt from 70 to 80%, reflecting information in water company business plans. As we set out in our PR19 methodology, the cost of new debt is indexed, and we'll reconcile this at the PR24. Indexation means that customers don't pay a risk premium on the forecast cost of new debt, and that companies are protected from increases in the market cost of debt. And as some of you no doubt will see from our documents released, our view of the cost of capital was based on data that up until the end of February. Since then, we have seen further downward pressure on some key parameters. Movements in the risk-free rate, beta, and the cost of new debt could mean a cost of capital potentially of up to 37 basis points lower than as set at the end of June. However, I'd also note that these are just observations about market movements. We will take our decision at final determination, taking a full view of the cost of capital in the round. Just Move on to RCV growth. So the level of the enhancement investment is reflected in the significant RCV growth we're expecting at PR19. 8 companies have RCV growth that exceed 10% in real terms in our draft determination. We consider it reasonable that equity contributes where RCV growth is high, and we take this into account in our assessment of financeability. Our assessment of financeability is consistent with the approach we've adopted at previous price reviews. We have defined financial ratios that will follow in the PR19 methodology. These are based on, but do not precisely follow, the definitions used by credit rating agencies. We haven't set thresholds for individual financial ratios, but we carry out our assessment in the round, taking account of the level and trend of financial ratios over time, and on the basis of which board assurance statements have been given. We consider that our determinations to be financeable on a notional basis, taking account of our interventions. The financeability of our draft determination is helped by the transition to indexation on a CPIH basis. This has the effect of bringing revenue forward in a similar manner to adjustments to pay-go or RCV runoff rates. But to manage the transition of price controls to CPIH basis, our policy is that we index 50% of the opening RCV to RPI, and the rest, including new RCV, is indexed to CPIH. The results of our financeability assessment, we have assumed an equity injection is required at Portsmouth Water, partly to finance the new Havant Thicket Reservoir, and we've assumed dividend restrictions in the case of Affinity Water, and for some other cases, we're also assuming that notional financeability can be maintained through a reduction in dividend yields under the notional financial structure. The PR19 methodology allows the use of pay-go and RCV runoff levers to address financeability constraints due to cash flows, and we've made further interventions in company plans either to reduce the revenue brought forward for 6 companies or to allow adjustments for 3 companies to maintain notional financeability. Just going back a slide. So the impact on bills has been mentioned. There's quite a broad range of bill impacts across companies. You'll notice from 2% reduction to a 26% reduction, but with most companies clustered in a range of around 10 to 17%. And these reductions reflect both the level of investment in company plans, the split of TOTEX between operating and capital costs, and the efficiency gains being made. Key drivers of bill reductions are the lower cost of capital, improved base efficiency, and changes in the balance between operating and capital costs. And these factors have enabled us to square the circle and increase resilience and investment at the same time as keeping bills affordable. Jump around a bit in my slides. Not there yet. So firstly, just moving on to the back and balance. So as Johnson mentioned, in July 2019, we published our back and balance statement that aimed to encourage companies to take greater account of their customers' interests and set out expectations for companies in terms of their transparency around dividend and performance-related executive pay policies, and an expectation for companies with high gearing to share the benefits with their customers. All companies have made firm commitments about their proposals in regard to dividend and executive pay transparency. However, in most cases, we think there's further to go in terms of working through the details of how companies will demonstrate the particular measures that they're taking account of, and we expect to see that by final determination. All companies have adopted our gearing up performance sharing mechanism. However, Thames Water, South Staffs and Bristol Water proposed their own versions of the mechanism, and we have assessed these proposals but not accepted their proposed changes, and these companies will be required to adopt, or are required to adopt, the default mechanism in our draft determination. So return on regulated equity. So this chart attempts to set out the potential dispersion from both outcome delivery incentives, TOTEX, out and underperformance, and financing costs, and shows you the potential up and downside risk that companies are exposed to over PR19. So, as mentioned, the PR19 price review does increase the proportion of revenue at risk from service performance through ODIs and sharpens the cost-sharing incentives. These will benefit efficient companies, with inefficient companies losing out. We have set outcome delivery incentives, caps and collars on individual performance commitments to limit overall risk exposure. The sharpening of incentives does not mean the sector as a whole should expect to receive the returns that are skewed to the downside, rather that companies should expect to be rewarded for the provision of high quality and efficient services, and that inefficient companies should bear a higher proportion of underperformance. So in conclusion, our draft determinations will deliver real benefits to customers, better service, more investment, lower bills, while continuing to ensure that efficient companies are financeable. PR19 will both enable and challenge companies to improve productivity and service for customers. Companies that succeed will be rewarded. Companies that don't will bear the cost and earn lower returns. Their future really is in their hands. We have set out our position clearly. Companies now have an opportunity to review our draft decisions and to reconsider their plans. We'll look carefully at the representations we receive before we make our final decisions in December. We will now take questions.
Thank you, David. So there you have it. The context of the review, the context of the review in the overall strategy and forward look of Ofwat, and the programme from David that we've set out. We'll turn to questions. The way I'd like to propose to do it, let's try and keep questions pretty concise if we could. If you feel like you have subsequent or follow-up ones, perhaps you could route them through Jamie afterwards. We'll take questions first from the floor, and then occasionally I'll go to Jamie, who's receiving questions that are coming in from the webcast, and most will be taken. So please just say who you are, say your question, and then so I've got 3 to start with. So I've seen 3 people, so we'll start there, and I'll allocate them to one of our team, either Rachel or David, or we have Andy here, or Jamie. Okay.
Thanks. It's Jenny Ping from Citi. 2 questions, please, both on wax. I understand that you had to have a cut-off point, which you've signed to the end of February. But given you've done the work to update it to the end of June, why did you not use the lower number to start and use that as your sort of draft determination rather than defer back to February and warn the possibility of the downside? And then secondly, you talked about setting a WACC in the round. Should I be reading that as you won't just be doing a mechanistic update and you will be considering other factors in that WACC settlement? And if so, what other softer issues will you be considering? Thank you.
I think, David, that one's for you.
Thank you. So I'll deal with, I think, the second question first, because I think it helps illuminates the first question. So when we do look at the WACC, we clearly do look at the evidence and the data that's available to us, and we need to weigh it up and consider it. When we're setting draft and final determinations, we are looking at the settlement in the round when we set company settlements. So there is a wider consideration of issues in terms of the reasons why we have used the early view of the February view of the cost of capital. So that is our, the view we've set out, the 21 basis points low is our view of the cost of capital at draft determinations. We have sought to provide transparency around our view around how the market data has moved since the cut-off date. We note it's reasonably unusual to have such a significant movement over this time period, so we thought it was valuable to set that out and be transparent around that. But it's not those numbers are not the numbers we've taken as a board at Ofwat and said that's the cost of capital. We'd still have to work through that evidence. We've described the range, we've described where those numbers have come from, but it's certainly not the case that those would be the numbers if we were to set the WACC at FD. We will have to look at what they mean, and you'll have noticed maybe in the detail of our advisors' reports, for example, their view of the change in the market data of this period is 21 basis points. So there's still quite some work to do before we'd reach a view about the final view of the WACC. In terms of the early cut-off point, I'd have to say there's some administrative convenience in that from our perspective. So there's obviously a lot of modelling goes on in terms of the price review process. And so we took the decision we would set the view of the WACC relatively early in our draft determination process. We won't necessarily have the luxury of that at final determination. We will have to look at all factors closer to the time. But clearly we'd prefer to take an earlier view and hold it if we can in terms of making sure that we are modelling and understanding the implications of the WACC in terms of when we look at a company's business plan. So, as a board, we do look at both the business plan and what the WACC means in terms of the actual numbers that are turning out in the draft and final determination. So it's not just a case of saying the risk-free rates move, therefore the WACC will move automatically.
Thank you, David. And I'd underline David's comment. It's a board decision taken in the round, and of course that's one of the reasons why there is a time lag. Dominic, let me turn to you.
Okay, thank you. It's Dominic Nash from Barclays. You won't be surprised it's going to be probably following up on WACCs. I mean, on our numbers, if you take your WACC at face value, the cost of equity, your forward-looking is coming at 2.8% real, around that level here. And I think the biggest driver for that, getting it down there, is it's been the fall in beta that we've seen. And you're using a 2-year beta calculation to get there. Is that 2-year beta calculation likely to remain as we go into the draft determination? And is that 2.8% realistically what the number you would have given if you were going to do the draft determination today? And just got a follow-up question, sorry, on the on that number. Is that enough, do you think? I mean, it's a lovely academic systematic risk return, but do you think that's enough to get the discretionary equity into the re-equitisation of the sector, or discretionary capex into getting sort of improvements and services up to take into account the cash flow risk that the sector faces, which is obviously a diversifiable risk of nationalisation, for example?
Yes, okay. So just going to reiterate the point, our view of the cost of equity at draft determination is the numbers we have set out rather than the potential implications of changes in the markets. And we do think that is a sufficient cost of equity in terms of making the water sector remains an attractive investment. And so in terms of the view about how we calculate betas, I think we do put a lot of weight on the 2-year evidence. We've also looked at shorter and longer periods. There's obviously a range of views in terms of the wider community around views around long-term betas versus shorter-term measures. Our concern is that if you go too shorter-term, you're actually exposed to volatility, that just, i.e. the numbers move around without telling you very much. If you go for a longer time period, then there's a risk your data looks very old. Potentially you're drawing data from the previous price review period, to inform your views about the appropriate cost of equity for the next price review period. So there is a balance to be struck. I don't think there's any magic answer to that. We do think that a 2-year range, it gives us enough data points to give you a statistically robust number, but it's also quite current. And so that's probably all I can say in terms of how we'll take a view on that.
Thank you. Question here, and then I'll go to Jamie for any of that have come in from the web, and then come back to the audience.
Hi, it's Mark Freshney from Credit Suisse. I have two questions. Firstly, generally, going through the documents, it appears you're very, very wedded to this mechanical process on the capital asset pricing model. Just wondering whether, just looking at IRRs and returns is the right way to be looking at this, because investors buy this sector for the dividend yield. Clearly, you need a higher dividend yield in the UK just now for the political risks. So I'm just wondering whether there needs to be another wider conversation about other valuation metrics. Secondly, looking at the returns and the process for setting those returns, compared to when the 2.3% real was set almost a couple of years ago now, and the 2.1, it seems the main component driving that is the gearing assumption has gone up because the share prices have gone down. So in a way, because we've had 2 years of weak share prices following publication of various manifestos 2 years ago, it's basically led to a lower return, which seems very perverse to me. So can you talk about whether you think that's right?
Okay. So just firstly, in terms of the couple asset pricing model and the use of that, It is something that regulators do consider from time to time. The recent UKRN study on this also looked at the issue again, and I guess it's sort of a bit like democracy. It's the worst of that's the worst way of doing things, but there isn't any better way that we can see. And so I think you're right that we do need to look at the broader evidence, and we have set out in our document how we do look at a range of inputs into the measures we derive. So in terms of trying to reach views about market returns, we look at historical evidence, we look at more contemporary evidence, and do try to weigh it up. So we do look as broadly as we can at the evidence available to us, but I do think in terms of there is a long-established precedent for using the capital asset pricing model. It has delivered results over time that have worked in terms of the regulated sectors, in terms of striking a fair balance of returns, and so I wouldn't like to, in terms of proposing a major change at this point in the process, I don't think would be a sensible approach. In terms of the change in the equity beta, you're right that some of this is driven by, in terms of the gearing up and down of betas, in terms of moving from a raw beta through to an unlevered beta and back up again, to a view about the beta for the national company. I think one of the benefits we've got in the water sector, though, is we do have two pretty pure play listed companies who happen to have gearing at a level very similar to the national company. So if you're uncomfortable with the results of the gearing up and gearing down process, you can just observe the equity betas of those companies directly, and that's certainly they certainly pitch in at a slightly lower level than we get out of the gearing up and de-gearing process. So in a sense, I think you're right that a market sentiment about valuation does impact on this calculation, but it's not just manifestos that have been published out there. Arguably the companies that are listed are performing well, and their valuations could be seen, perhaps higher than some of the other unlisted companies in the sector. So it's not clear to me the direction of the impact to market valuations is to the disadvantage of the WACC calculation from an investor perspective. And the point in terms of where valuations are at now versus long-term trends, they're actually, believe it or not, slightly above in terms of the RCV, the premium to the RCV.
Just remind us where the premium was yesterday, Jamie.
The current premiums, I think most people have it pretty close to double digits, just over 10% to 13%, that sort of range. The long-term average going back to 1993 is 9%.
So in terms of the argument that somehow or other the beta calculation is too low because of the change in market valuations, I don't think is either borne out by the current position, or if you look in terms of the broader evidence around the riskiness of these companies.
Thank you, David. I'm going to hold that one there if I could. Now I'm going to go to Jamie for any questions from the webcast, but if anyone in the audience wants to ask a question following, raise your hand, two over there, Verity, and I can't quite see who it is on the corner. We can get the mic over to you guys as well. Jamie, are there any ones particularly, while we're on the WACC issues, that you want to raise from the webcast?
Well, the one is just someone sort of thinking ahead to what are the real areas. Normally we're in a funneling process, and they're just interested about the main areas for potential adjustments between now and FDs. What's the focus? What should they be talking to companies about?
So in terms of costs, I think it's worth just touching on that briefly in terms of views about cost efficiency. So we've distinguished between base and enhancement costs. And in terms of the base cost, we're modelling that off using econometric models. And so there are some questions around the productivity shift we're setting for the sector and the use of real price effects. So we've made a change between the IAP version of costs and the draft determinations to allow for real price effects of labour, which effectively reduces the frontier shift set for the sector. So that'll be a question in terms of the modelling approach. I guess there'll be the usual questions about the data in the model and the particular parameters, although we have now very well established cost models that we've been through a fairly exhaustive process, and so we wouldn't expect to see many changes in that area. In terms of enhancement costs, I could lump them into several buckets. So there's debates with companies around what we would term as catch-up costs. So if costs for funding things like leakage or upper quartile performance, where we've been very clear that we won't be funding those. So I would say there's less scope for change in that space because it's a matter of our methodology. There are other areas of costs. So some of the investments proposed, say in the resilience space, where we're indicating to companies that In principle, there could be a case that they're making, but they haven't met the evidence threshold in terms of what we've set out, and so we would expect to see some companies respond to that and come back with evidence that may be more persuasive than they've put to us, and so that could lead to an adjustment and enhancement costs. And then, so those are probably the main areas in terms of cost. And then in terms of outcomes, we've set out how we reach views around the outcome performance commitments. Obviously, there's a new year of data for both outcome performance commitments and costs, and so we'll have to look at the implications of that in terms of both the cost models and in terms of the outcome performance commitment levels. And in terms of outcome delivery incentives, I think we've set out a very clear methodology for how we've made adjustments, and so companies will have the opportunity to respond against those.
Let's take a pause there, David. Thank you. I'm going to come back to the audience now. We'll come back to Jamie later. Over.
Good morning. Am I on?
Yes.
I think you are. Yes, I can hear you.
Chris Lobert, JP Morgan. Two questions, but they're both related. The first is just in terms of the cut-off date for the FD. When should we expect you to be, I guess, taking data from? So what's the equivalent of the 28th of February for the end of the year? In terms of investor concerns, we're hearing some or many investors concerned that we may see a dip in financial data and macro settings that may impact returns, and then in the years that follow that, we may see bond yields, for instance, tread towards a higher level. It's an age-old question, but indexation is one solution. Ofgem are considering that now. What do you think of that as a concept, thinking forward to the next review and more generally?
Let me just see. I don't think you'll ever get us to absolutely tie down our board decision-making process in a procedural way. But Rachel, do you want to deal with that, or should David?
So in terms of the cut-off date, we won't, in terms of we've talked about autumn, in terms of finalising the data, there's a balance to be struck. Ideally, markets wouldn't move between making our decision, and but obviously it's quite a busy time over the next few months for the UK economy. So we will take a view, and we'll run our models through that, but we will also have to look as we get closer to final determination, is that view still relevant and correct? And so there will be a balance to be struck in terms of, so it will be more demanding than the draft determination process when we've been able to take a view and accept that markets may move, because we can pick that up at final determination. So it won't be such an early cut-off for final determination, but it is a question regulators face at each price review. And then in terms of market movements beyond final determination, so we have built in some indexation in terms of the cost of debt for PR19. In terms of the cost of equity, it does feel very much like a risk that equity holders bear in the sector in terms of movements over time, and the historical evidence would point to that these shifts have been in favour of investors. And that may be a reason from a regulator's perspective to introduce more indexation, because it avoids the risk of error. And I'm sure that will be something we'll think about for PR24, but it's not something for PR19 at this point.
Thank you, David. Verity, over to you.
Yes, morning. Verity Mitchell, HSBC. I've got two questions. The first one is a clarification, really, on your change in gearing assumptions. Is that partly a function of the fact that there is so much RCV growth in the sector, so you thought that was appropriate? And is that applicable to all companies, irrespective of their embedded debt versus their new debt? That's the first, just clarify that. And then secondly, I suppose it's a question to Rachel about the long-term aspirations of Ofwat. Even the enhanced companies have tried to or delivered real reductions in bills. And so do you think this 5-year process is fit for purpose in trying to deliver things like long-term resilience when the companies seem to strive to want to reduce bills in absolute terms?
Thank you. David, do you want to do the first part, and then we'll...
Sure. So the gearing assumption in terms of the level of debt to equity hasn't changed, so it remains 60%. We have changed our view about the level of embedded debt, so that was 70%. At the IAP, it's now 80%. And that is very much based on company business plan data, which gives us a fairly clear view of their expectations of raising finance over the period and their level of existing finance. So the 80% is slightly higher than the number we used at PR14, which was 75%, which is somewhere in between the 70 and 80% numbers.
Yeah, in terms of your question about is the 5-year process fit for purpose if you're actually trying to drive resilience, I mean, we know, obviously, I come from Ofgem, we experimented with longer price reviews and then they've gone back to shorter price reviews. I think we do need to keep the 5-year periodicity to keep the focus on efficiency and to pass through productivity gains to customers. I think that's an important part of how we regulate, and that's part of what today's conversation is all about. I think there are other tools that we can use to keep the focus on resilience, and those of you that have read our draft strategy document might have picked up that we are starting a bit of a process to think about whether we could be driving greater reporting around asset condition, asset health, so that we are able as a regulator and as an industry to keep a closer eye on what is actually happening to the assets. The performance commitments that we've got in the price review are the right ones, but they're very much lagging indicators of what's happening to asset health. But I think they're complementary tools and techniques that we can use as a regulator and as a sector to drive that focus on resilience.
Thank you, Rachel. Jamie, is there a question from you? And then I'm coming to the middle here.
Yeah, there's one online asking about whether our view on the need for headroom in investment grade ratings has changed.
Okay. No, in terms of, I think the short answer. So we have looked, so we've asked companies to submit to us their views around their notional and actual views around their target credit ratings. And most companies have targeted 2 notches above investment grade. There are 4 companies that haven't done so on an actual basis, and we have applied more scrutiny to their finances on that basis. That's something we have taken into account, but we haven't set a view around what the right answer is. But there's a fair degree of convergence in the sector.
To behind, and then we'll pass the mic forward, Andrew.
James Brand from Deutsche Bank. Given the cut in the cost of capital, companies' performance under TOTEX and ODI incentives is going to be a really important factor in terms of delivering returns throughout the next regulatory period. And you've said throughout this process that you are setting upper quartile targets for companies to hit in terms of those different cost and outcome-based performance measures. And you've often said you're using dynamic upper quartile or forward-looking upper quartile targets. I was wondering whether you could just give a bit more detail in terms of how you've gone about that, because it's still a little bit unclear, at least in my mind, how much those upper quartile measures are based on performance today, and maybe you've rolled forward a little bit to adjust for changes in scope, or how much you're actually modelling productive improvements in the upper quartile targets going forward. Because you're also saying in your regulatory document that a P50 performance allows a company to earn its cost of equity. So you're explicitly assuming that companies are all, on average, going to meet that upper quartile target, and therefore, obviously, in definition, it won't actually be upper quartile by that point. So if you could give some details on how you get to upper quartile, that'd be really interesting.
Okay, so in terms of costs, we generally, in terms of wholesale costs, we take a view about historical upper quartile. Actually, in terms of the data we're using is historical. We do have business plan data, which we have looked at in terms of what forecast upper quartile would look like. But in terms of setting cost efficiency challenges, they're based on historical upper quartile data. But we do apply a frontier shift to that to try to replicate what upper quartile would be expected to be by 2025, and that's where taking a view around the productivity gains expected in the wider economy and a view around any real price, input price pressures that might be faced in the sector is what drives that number. In terms of the retail cost models, we have used forward-looking cost data in regard to that, so we don't apply a frontier shift to the forward-looking cost data, but we've given 50% weight to historical costs and 50% to forward-looking data. And in terms of the performance commitments themselves, these are based on forecast upper quartile performance. So we've asked all companies to forecast upper quartile performance for the next period, and we've looked at that data and reached a view around what the appropriate level that ought to be set for those performance commitments that do have an upper quartile basis. But we've also looked at the changes achieved by the sector historically. And so, in a number of those key areas, there's quite significant movements every AMP in terms of improvements by the sector. So in terms of pollution incidents or internal sewer flooding. And so that has also informed our view about is the information in the business plans is it plausible and realistic in terms of can the sector reach these targets? And when you look at the historic gains achieved by the sector, we are comfortable that they're reasonable numbers.
Can I just ask
Very quick, yeah.
That if you're saying you're trying to forecast the upper quartile, but yet you're expecting companies to broadly, break even on incentives, are you assuming a much bigger catch up then of the underperformers? You're assuming that things really compress and that everyone gets pretty close to the upper quartile to be in that position?
So we are assuming that customers are paying for a level of stretching service performance by companies, and so yes, we are expecting companies to reach those performance levels, or they'll incur penalties, and therefore their customers will receive compensation in the form of lower bills. But we are taking a view around what's reasonable for an efficient company to achieve, and so we do look at, as I say, historical performance improvements as well as what's coming through company business plans. I think the encouraging thing I see from the revised business plans is actually in many cases companies are accepting these challenges, so they're not changes that the companies are contesting in the main.
Good. James, thank you. Come.
Yes, Ian Turner from Exane. Obviously the sector's been very kind of controversial over the past couple of years. And if you look back at the most recent investor survey that you did, there was a big step down from investors' perception of the Ofwat level of independence from government. I just wonder whether that's something that you worry about, and how you've tried to conduct things going forward to try and give investors more confidence in this process and in your independence.
So let me say a little bit, Ian, and then pass to Rachel.
Actually, it was really aimed at you.
Well, we'll share it between us, Rachel and I. So that comment arose, I think, last year when we were challenged by the government, by the Secretary of State, essentially on the legitimacy of the sector. Now, we are independent. For instance, no part of any of this PR19 process has been discussed with government. That decision is arrived at by our board independently, and investors can have that assurance. But this is an industry of national significance, and I think it's only to be encouraged that Secretary of State and other senior ministers in government take a keen interest and have a perfectly legitimate interest in the sector. And you'll have seen when we were challenged in that, we responded in our way as regulators, and we took that into account. So I would contest that there is any increase in political engagement. Our independence remains as strong as ever. And as you know, Ian, I've lived through many periods in this sector, periods of other challenge. It's been said before, but look at the track record here. 7th price review, undertaken independently. Rachel, do you want to add anything?
I mean, I think the only thing I'd add is we also have to listen to what customers and ordinary people in the street are saying and are concerned about. And we bring that into thinking about the long term, the investability of the sector, the need to provide for future customers, as well as address the issues of the day. So I think the thing that has concerned me is people equating, if you like, Ofwat picking up on some of the mood and looking to respond to that and some of the policy decisions that we've been making with us being losing our independence. And I think I would draw the distinction between being lent on by government on the one hand, which, as Johnson said, we certainly have not been under any pressure officially or unofficially in any part of PR19 or indeed on any of the other policy decisions that we've made. So I'd make the distinction between a regulator that is independent and a regulator that is also listening and wanting to respond to the concerns of the public. And I think it's important, and in the industry's interest, that we do listen, because that is where some of the keys to legitimacy are going to be found. And that's why you've seen us, move on quite at speed with the back in balance agenda. And that's why you see us, as we talk about the vision for the future, and we set out our strategy, really taking a greater recognition of the role that this sector can play in society.
There you've got it here. Thank you. Now, we're coming to the close. So is there anyone left who wants to ask a question? I've got one down here. So let's go here, and then Jamie, I'll come to you. If anyone else has a question, just raise your hand now, or shortly, so I know.
Hi, it's Sharon Beaton, Columbia Threadneedle. There are 4 highly leveraged structures that you look at amongst the companies you cover. Over PR24, over the next 5 years, I still not go to PR24 yet, what are you planning to do about these 4, especially one who has quite a bit of work to do over the next few weeks?
Okay, 4 highly leveraged structures among the big 9 English companies. Do you want to tackle that one, David?
I can start.
But we're not going to start discussing PR24, I assure you, Sharon.
So I think the first point to make is that we've been very clear with companies about expectations about getting their finances in order in terms of to address the challenges at PR19. So we told companies, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, in terms of our intentions around the review. We set it out in the methodology. So companies have had quite a long run up at this in terms of understanding the direction of travel, understanding our views in terms of making sure that they're financially resilient. As part of their business plans, we've sought assurances from their board around financial resilience, and we've tested and challenged that. We are seeking further assurance from a number of companies in terms of their business plans, in terms of the revised, in terms of the response to draft determinations. There are a number of companies that are in the process, and some companies are proposing to undertake various mitigations, such as injecting more equity into their businesses. Some companies have quite well advanced with that process. Other companies are still in the process of working through that. So I am confident that companies are able to address the challenges. They are now very clear in terms of the draft determination around the impacts for their particular finances. And companies are, this is not a surprise to companies. They've in the main anticipated this.
Sharon, I'd just underline what David said. We have been giving notice on the need for financial resilience for a number of years, and actually this determination very clearly puts with companies the responsibility for sustainable financing. You have a follow-up, I think. Quick follow-up.
Yeah, it'll be a very quick one. Just on that point on equity, further equity injection, then the ways of further equity injection are quite imaginative. What are you going to do? When I'm looking at company structures, there are shareholder loans lines everywhere, dividend payments, interest payments on shareholder loans. How are you going to simplify the structure? Because part of resilience and legitimacy is also about simplifying these complex structures going forward. How are you going to address that, or are you going to?
So I'm not going to have a long discussion on shareholder loans here, but David or Rachel, do you want to say a bit about that? Do you want to?
Okay. So in terms of, we completely agree that excessively complex and opaque structures don't enhance the sector's legitimacy, and certainly raise questions around financing. Companies are taking steps to simplify the structures and to be more transparent around those. And we do have a work programme in terms of making very clear in terms of where companies do have financing structures that are different from the notional structures, both their level of returns and their level of dividends and how that compares. So I think the sector is definitely moving in that direction. I think there may be a question around some of the financing proposals companies have put forward. That is a question for them and their boards. We will obviously be looking very critically at their financial resilience when they come back with their revised business plans.
They just add one thing to that. I mean, part of the back and balance agenda, and one of the things that attracted a lot of attention earlier this year, of course, was the decision for that Ofwat made to require highly leveraged companies to share the benefits of that leverage. That is an incentive to simplify structures, and you know, that's kind of part of the rationale behind the decisions that we made earlier in the year.
And it's indeed complemented by what we've recently said and consulting on about ring fencing of the regulated company, because that's the company that holds the licence. So if you want a longer discussion, Sharon, start with Jamie in the first instance. Jamie, is there any last one or two you want to come back at from the webcast?
There is one more, maybe. Just someone asking, what essentially, why does it make sense for companies being tasked to implement expensive short-term mechanical solutions to remove phosphorus from rivers, whereas there are cheaper, longer-term and more sustainable solutions on offer?
Well, I think you've heard from Rachel earlier how much we support longer-term sustainable solutions. But Rachel, do you want to add anything to?
Well, I mean, the incentives are there to use nature-based solutions, especially where they're cheaper. And I think one of the barriers to that happening more frequently is force of habit, actually, in the sector, and a mindset shift, as I mentioned, is required. I'm also aware that some of the Environment Agency's standards are very prescriptive and perhaps don't allow for the margin of error that you might require around a nature-based solution. I think that is an issue I am confident the Environment Agency wants to look into. And I think it's an area, if you like, that we would like to work with the Environment Agency on, so that we can see much more of these green solutions. I do, and I repeat what I said earlier, I think the water sector has got the opportunity to kind of rebrand itself, if you like, as an environmental services sector. And I think that would be an exciting proposition for investors, an exciting proposition for future employees, and an exciting proposition for the way the sector is viewed socially. So I think that is, we've got a role to play along with our fellow regulators in making sure that we remove barriers. But as I said, I think some of the key barrier is in the mindset and the force of habit within the companies themselves.
Veteran followers of this sector will remember much wider environmental to economic regulator debates in the past. Actually, the join-up is fantastic at the moment, working very smoothly. And as Rachel said, we encourage companies to continue to challenge and bring forward more sustainable and longer-term solutions. I think that's probably a moment to call a day, isn't it? I guess you're all anxious to get back to your desks or wherever. I thank you all and thank those on the webcast for attending today. We'll be around for a little while. Jamie is the point person to go to with any follow-up questions. Thank you very much for joining us today.